Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, it's our last programme of the summer, and I'm joined by some wonderful writers today, by the poet Joe Shapcott, whose latest collection of Mutability won the Costa Prize this year, and by the science fiction writer China Mieville, who's been compared with Kafka and Orwell, and whose new novel features creatures who cannot lie. But we're going to start with one of the great perennial questions. How much, if anything, do we need to know about the lives of great writers to fully appreciate their work? Jonathan Bate is one of our best Shakespearean scholars, and he's written the one-man show Being Shakespeare, currently being performed by Simon Callow. But we're going to start with one of the very few writers who rivals Shakespeare, Dante, subject of a new biography by AN Wilson. Andrew, your proposition is that to understand Dante, but particularly Paradise Lost, you've got to, the comedy, I should say, you've got to understand the medieval world, and the medieval world is slipping away from us.
I think that's true. I mean, Dante was a very extraordinary figure in the history of Europe, because he was arguably one of the great poets, such as Shakespeare and Goethe, but he was also one of those figures, one thinks of it this week particularly in Radio 4 terms, because of Aung San Suu Kyi's Wreath lectures. He's one of those figures who stood out alone against a totally corrupt political system, a bit like Solzhenitsyn did in the Soviet days. And people read this poem, The Divine Comedy, partly as a political thing. So that I think unless you understand what the setup was during his lifetime, it is quite hard to grasp why he was so angry and why he'd been chucked out of Florence. And it's again very topical, because at the basis of it all was the question of the European currency. That was the central fact, that the emperor alone could license money, could mint money, and there hadn't been an emperor since 1250. Dante was born in 1265, so for the first half of his life, when he was a rising politician as well as a great young poet, Florence, hence florins, was the place where money was minted. So who controlled Florence controlled Italy and Europe and ultimately the world. And that's why the popes and the would-be emperors were fighting to get the Florentines on side, because all the money in Europe, the only coin which anybody could exchange for value, was the florin from Florence. That's why Florence was the richest, biggest, most important city in Europe. And that's why he felt, with his rather old-fashioned Fogyish Christian views, he felt that Florence had given itself over to gold and money and been utterly destroyed and lost its soul.
And in the course of that, of course, he lost his own position in the extremely... I didn't realise until I was reading your book, I'd forgotten quite how violent and extreme the politics of Florence were, not simply between the pro-papal party and the pro-emperor party, but within the parties as well, the black and the white.
Within the parties, which were complicated, but actually the story of Dante is quite simple, namely that his father, who was a moneylender, in fact he kept pretty dark, married him off when he was about 12 years old, or betrothed him to one of these big mafia-style families, the Donati. And that was both the making of them, the Dante family, the Alighieri, but it was also the undoing of Dante Alighieri when he grew up, because he quarrelled with this man they called Il Barone, the Baron, who was a very nasty piece of work indeed, Corso Donati, who was his cousin, his wife's cousin. Other members of the family, who also come into the poem, he loved. Forese Donati, who was one of his best muckers as a rising young writer, and he swapped dirty jokes and sex poems and jokes about their impotence or otherwise and so forth. So, I mean, it's wrong to think of Dante as too solemn a figure. He wasn't.
And tell us about Pope Boniface VIII, because he's the other great sort of villain of the figure.
Well, he's Dante's bête noire. He was the Pope at the time when Dante, who was a very serious politician, I mean, when he was in his 30s, wanting to control Florence, Corso Donati and the Pope stitched Dante up. The Pope, all the popes in the Middle Ages except one, were canon lawyers. The Pope wanted to control not only the Italian peninsula but Europe itself, and he was a very smooth operator, Boniface VIII. he'd done all sorts of things. He'd been to England, he'd been to Portugal, he'd been all over Europe, with his finger in every pie. Very tall, gay, probably an atheist, which I think probably helps if you're Pope, because otherwise you can just be totally cynical.
Yes.
And Dante abominated him. The poem is set in the year 1300. They just invented the idea of purgatory about 50 years before, and Dante makes the idea of purgatory into a very beautiful one. And most Catholics' idea of purgatory doesn't really come from the Church. It actually comes from Dante, though they don't realise that. But the Pope suddenly saw the enormous cash value of this. You couldn't get to the Holy Land because of the Crusades going on. He quarrelled with the Eastern Church. So in order to save your soul and get time off purgatory, come to Rome for the Holy Year. And in that year, 1300, at Easter, when Dante went with the pilgrims, and he describes it all, there were priests in the main pilgrim centres with rakes, literally raking money off the altars.
Off the altar, yes.
And that was an image which stays in your head, I think.
For the modern reader,
yeah.
Dante, you remind us how intensely important the politics of the time are, European politics, but also the great religious questions of the time. For a reader who is not a Christian, how much is there in Dante?
Well, there's everything, because what he's writing about is human experience. This journey he makes through the three regions, which are mythological regions, hell, purgatory, heaven. It's the journey that we all make. The poem doesn't begin in the middle of my life, it begins in the middle of our life. Nel mezzo del cammino di nostra vita. And we all have the experience of total disillusionment and possible hell.
In the dark wood.
In the dark wood. We all go through a purgatory, and we all hope to get to some kind of self-fulfillment and realization. And for Dante, it was a revisitation of his childhood friendships and loves, and a rediscovery of what love is. And that's the central quest of his poem, to rediscover the love that he knew as a child for this little girl called Beatrice. And if that's not important and central to everybody, I don't know what is.
You use Proust a lot as a comparison.
He's very like Proust. He's very like Proust indeed, in that his personal vision is used and generalised to become the vision that we all share. So, although of course he's one of the great figures of Christian literature, you don't have to be a Christian to understand what he's writing about, any more than you have to be a Hindu to understand the Bhagavad Gita.
Jonathan Bate.
Yes, you call the biography Dante in Love, and when I picked it up I thought, oh, maybe this is going to be a novel, trying to imagine what it was like for Dante being in love. And although your conversation with Andrew has mostly been about the public historical side of the poem, you are actually trying to get a sense of what love meant to Dante. But isn't that a problem, in that ideas of being in love and what love means, and in particular being in love with a little 9-year-old girl, these are things that change through time? How did you sort of set about trying to get inside the mind of Dante in love?
I mean, one of the fascinating things about Dante, unlike Shakespeare, on whom you're an expert, is that he tells us so much about himself. And all the early work of Dante were either love poems, either the jokey love poems that I've described, or very serious love poems about what is the nature of love, and was Plato right about love, or da-da-da. Or they were prose commentaries on these works in which he tells us the story of his life over and over again. So he was an arch-egotist, and there's an awful lot of material, as a matter of fact, for a modern investigator. The funny thing about him, you say, surely the ideas of love change over the years. Well, they do, but on another level, when you listen to, instead of Radio 4, perish the thought, if you were listening to Radio 1, most of the songs you'd have heard this morning would have been love songs. And many of the ideas in pop songs and rock music about love actually stem from Dante. In many ways, he invented the idea of romantic love as something that can shape our lives. And most people do think that the important thing in our journey through this dark wood is to find somebody to love, and to find somebody who will help us to know what love means. And you could say he was the inventor of that idea, certainly the popularizer of it.
Joe Shapcott.
Yes, and he was also the inventor of the verse form that he uses in the comedy. And I was fascinated by how you described it as a verse form which allows you to say, and another thing, because it's those 3-line stanzas interlocking with a rhyme carried over to each stanza. It's hard to do in English because we have so many, a smaller proportion of rhyming words. And I wonder how far you thought that gets in the way for the English reader, that translations can't really express what you would find in Italian.
I think that's a very important point, and on the whole, the best translations of Dante for the English reader are the ones that don't try. Heroic old Dorothy L. Sayers, who wrote a jolly good effort in Terza Rima, in this first form that Dante invented. It's pretty excruciating after a few pages.
It's how I started. I think it's what put me off Dante when I was young.
Many people who think he's awful actually are hating Dorothy L. Sorry, John.
No. I was just wondering. You stress very much the importance of the social context in understanding him, and I'm wondering about the elision between understanding him and appreciating him at the level of poetry. Because you also talk about how he's been reinvented for every era, and I was really interested in his reclamation by Eliot and Pound as the first modernist, for example. And I was wondering whether you would see that as a misprision or a violence to Dante, or perfectly reasonable readings, but that you want to also add this focus on context, or whether they pull against each other.
That's a central question, actually, isn't it, about any kind of reading? Because are we making up the text that we read? And that, obviously one of the great things about critical theory was that we, the readers, are the people who invent the text in some ways. That there must be some element of truth in that. On the other hand, you've got to balance it against what did the author intend. Sometimes you can't tell what the author intended, but in Dante's case you can, because he writes so clearly and so often about what the actual intention is.
Well, let's move from Dante, about whom, as Andrew Wilson said, we know so much, to Shakespeare, about whom conventionally we're told we know almost nothing at all. But Jonathan Bate, you've made a lifelong study of Shakespeare, and in this performance by Simon Callow, which you've written, Being Shakespeare, you argue pretty vociferously that actually we know more about Shakespeare's life than we think we do.
Yeah, that's right. We know more about Shakespeare than we think we do. What the problem is that the documents about Shakespeare's life that survive are basic stuff to do with records of birth, marriage, death, property transactions, business deals, being late on his tax return, that sort of thing. They don't really take us to his interior life. So how do we get to Shakespeare's interior life? Well, we have his works, which must at some level be a witness to his interior life. But the problem, the trick, is that plays are not confessions or diaries or autobiographies, that the ways in which the plays reveal the interior life are indirect. And that's why there are so many puzzles and questions, and why, in a way, we have to come at the question from a sort of odd angle. Although, having said that, for me, the starting point in writing the play and trying to sort of dramatise the journey of Shakespeare's life was the realisation that there is a character in Shakespeare, in The Merry Wives of Windsor, who is a clever schoolboy called William, who is given a Latin lesson by a Welsh schoolmaster. William Shakespeare was a clever schoolboy called William, who had a Welsh schoolmaster. And that scene, that lovely little sort of comic Latin scene, was my starting point for thinking, yes, there is a way of extracting William the man from the play.
Well, it's very interesting because in your play, that's a very crucial part. The moment when Simon Callow goes through for us the grammatical education of a young grammar school boy at that time, and then starts to relate it to the structure of Shakespearean speeches. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, what I did in the play, I mean, Simon had done this one-man play about Dickens, which was very successful. He asked me to do something similar about Shakespeare when he read my book Soul of the Age, which divided Shakespeare's life into 7 ages, as in the famous 7 Ages of Man speech. And in doing the research for the play, I asked some really basic questions like, what was it like to be a child in Elizabethan England? And of course, what you quickly discovered is that young children, boys, were reared entirely by women, by mothers and nursemaids. Indeed, they wore dresses. But then at the age of 7, they would be breeched, which meant put into trousers. They would be made male, made masculine, and that would be the moment when they would start having Latin lessons and going to the male environment of the schoolroom. So already there in the just a sort of fact of social history combined with a detail in a play, you begin to see a pattern of the development of Shakespeare's life.
What you don't try to do is to answer or fill in some of the great gaps and questions in Shakespeare's life, the huge period when we know nothing at all about him, after he got married and before he appears as a fully fledged actor in London. But you do, for instance, point to the vast amount of interest in things military in Shakespeare, which is not often talked about, but there's endless armies and fighting and so on, which must lead you at some level to think that missing period must have had some military and possibly travelling part to it. Yeah,
it was interesting. That was a sort of discovery for me, having decided to structure the play around the 7 ages: the infant, the schoolboy, the lover, the soldier, the justice, the sort of the world of the law, the old man. The soldier sort of seemed to be the one where there was least relevance to Shakespeare's life. But then, as you say, the plays are just full of soldiers, not just those history plays that are full of battles, but also, Benedick and his friends in the comedy Much Ado About Nothing, they're coming back from the wars. And then also the scene that I think, together with that schoolboy scene, the other scene that feels to me most autobiographical in Shakespeare, it's the extraordinary scene in Henry IV, Part 2, where the recruiting officer, Sir John Falstaff, is down in Gloucestershire, on the borders of Gloucestershire and Warwickshire, absolutely in Shakespeare country, recruiting for the militia. And I started doing some work on this and found that there was something approximating to compulsory national service.
Given the number of people who were in the militia in Elizabethan England, I was astonished by this.
Yeah, I mean there were on the so-called muster rolls, there are 600,000 names. Now, given how small the population was compared with how it is now, that in modern terms would be the equivalent of about 8 million people. Sort of the modern equivalent would be sort of, as it were, compulsorily signed up for the territorial army. Yeah. I bet you Shakespeare was one of them.
Yes. And in terms of the other cloudy area, which is what happened to his marriage and what happened to him in London, again, there being a lack of evidence probably for this in the plays, you've by and large skated over that.
Yeah, I have. I mean, I didn't want to kind of go too far into, I leave to my wife my second best bed, that sort of thing, because the question of Shakespeare's marriage is one of those areas where the evidence can be interpreted in diametrically opposite ways.
He's very young. She's considerably older.
Exactly. But they have 3 children before the age of 21. They remain married for the rest of his life, but no more children subsequently. He's in London working a lot of the time. What he's doing in London, there are rumours that he has affairs. There's a pretty strong likelihood that there was a bisexual element, certainly to his imagination, if not to his behaviour. But the fact is, a lot of the other dramatists at the time tended to leave their wives and move on, whereas Shakespeare did always go back.
And then returns, of course, right at the end to Stratford, where there's another strange period where he's basically given up writing.
He's slowed down. I mean, we in the play where you're dramatising the life and covering a lot of material in a short space, we rather had to compress this. But actually, the idea that Shakespeare retired to Stratford in 1611 and drowned his books like Prospero and the Tempest, that's not quite true, because what he did was he appointed a successor younger dramatist called John Fletcher as dramatist to his acting company, and he and Fletcher actually co-wrote some plays into 1613, 1614. We see Shakespeare in London only a year before his death.
It makes me think that Shakespeare regarded the question of being an author as something that was very different from how authors would regard themselves. Now, his job was to provide the material which kept the company going, and once the company was ticking over and was going with somebody else, the job had been done. So it wasn't a question of I must leave for posterity my works.
That's absolutely right. He wasn't at all precious about being an author. He was a consummate professional. The modern equivalent would be the screenwriter, the script writer. And the best business decision of his life was to form a joint stock company. He became a shareholder with his actors, and he got a share of the box office. That's the great dream for
he got a percentage. He got his percentage. Joe Shapcott.
Yeah, of course we know Shakespeare was an actor, and that's a huge part of his life and imagination. And I just wondered what it was like working with an actor like Simon on the play, whether he had special insight or affinity with the language and just the whole sensibility of the fellow actor Shakespeare.
Yeah, no, he did, absolutely. I mean, for me, it was a thrill and a fantastic learning experience to develop this in rehearsal with Simon, precisely for that reason that he always brought an actor's view to it. And in the end, the thread that unites all those different ages, all those different aspects of Shakespeare's personality is the idea that we are all players, we are all actors. And sometimes, I mean, there was a wonderful moment in the rehearsal room when we were doing the famous Henry V once more Under the Breach speech. And suddenly Simon saw something that I'd never seen, that if you actually look at what King Henry is saying to his men, telling them what to do as they go into the battlefield, they are like instructions to an actor. He's telling them what to do with their
Make
eyes,
yourself
their
look
nostrils.
really
That's
fierce.
right. Exactly.
Flare
exactly.
your nostrils.
Yeah.
That was a really good bit, I thought, when he said that was Henry V teaching them how to act rather than how to fight.
And all the other bit that really struck me was where Simon Callow is saying, Shakespeare had the greatest clown of the age, and then he does a bit of clowning, and as well as the young boy actor who was the greatest portrayer of women on the all-male stage, and so on. So that actually,
yeah, it's that idea. He's a member of the company, so he writes each of those parts, knowing who is the actor who's going to create that part.
China, Mieville.
Well, following directly on from that, I'm wondering about the form of this piece for you, because you're also an academic and a teacher and so on. And so, is this even an answerable question? Do you think of this piece as a piece of pedagogy that is performed, or did you think of it very much as a performance? Because there are certain sections where a lot of information is kind of given in a fairly straightforward way. Shakespeare's this these were the events.
Yeah, I mean, the genre was decided for me, as it were, by Simon Callow asking me to do it. It's a genre that he's very interested in. It goes back to a great actor called Michael McLearmore who performed a thing about Oscar Wilde called The Importance of Being Oscar. And in this genre, it's a kind of one-man show that you just tell the story of the writer's life, but then you become their characters. Now, I wanted to do something a little more creative at the end of that. In my original draft, in the final age, Simon was actually going to become Shakespeare and speak in Shakespeare's voice. It was going to be the meeting of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson on the last night of Shakespeare's life, where Shakespeare would give a kind of apologia for his work. And Simon actually liked it, but the director didn't. The director felt actually risking speaking cod Elizabethan wasn't going to work, so we lost that.
Very interesting experience, because all those drafts and losing work that you've kind of presumably
I've certainly learned about the difference.
Presumably Shakespeare himself had.
Presumably Shakespeare did.
One of the things I really liked about it,
cut.
you brought out it's almost like trying to Marxist point in a way, that none of these great Elizabethan writers, after the age of patronage, as John and Philip Sidney and Tower did, could have done their work unless there had been, it's a very obvious point, but unless there had been a theatre. And it was this family called Burbage, which you bring out brilliantly in this play, that they were carpenters and builders, and they actually saw the potential of building this dirty great building, this huge building, in which plays could be performed for profit. Hitherto they've been out of doors and so forth.
But then you have to get the punters in. They have to arrive with their pennies, and you have to give them spectacle.
But it meant this extraordinary new opportunity for a new form of literature to come.
Yeah.
It isn't.
You have the professional entertainment industry for the first time.
But it isn't. It isn't an accident. It's an economic inevitability that there will be great dramatists once you've got a great theatre.
Well, let's move to another professional entertainer now, Joe Shapcott. You're not often described that way, Joe. But your latest collection of poems, Of Mutability, which won the Costa Book of the Year in 2010, is heavily based on your period of illness, and yet you would argue very strongly against reading biographically back from poems into some sort of biographical truth. You like very much the poem as a separate entity to hang outside the life of the poet.
I think that's right. I think actually Jonathan described it very well when he was saying that for Shakespeare the plays are not autobiographical confessions, and I would say that's certainly true of my poems. And he went on to say they're better described as the experiential DNA of the author. And I think that difference is really important and quite interesting.
Is that the difference between a poem as being something that is, as it were, open to attracting many, many different personalities, ages, people of both genders and so forth, as against something which is a closed part of one person's experience?
I think that's essential. And I think one thing that puts readers off poetry is that they think it's a kind of personal code that if they don't have the key, they won't ever be able to crack. And I think the more a poem is private confession, a private world, the more the readers are perhaps right to think that. And so I think for my book, although, yes, you're right, it was obviously informed by the period I spent having treatment for breast cancer, the book never mentions those words once, breast cancer. Yes. But it's more like a series of meditations on mortality, obviously informed by that experience. But I hope it's open to any of us, and that's nearly all of us, who have shared that experience, whether personally or whether someone we know has died or been very ill. Once a sense of mortality hits you, you don't lose it. And I hope the poems express that, and that people can relate to them in that way.
And these are poems about mortality which emphasise freshness, greenness, life, geography, openness. They're not in any sense, it's not a dark book.
It's strangely cheerful, which surprises me even. The title of Mutability was chosen really in tribute to an artist whose work sort of is the presiding spirit of the book, called Helen Chadwick. It was the title of one of her exhibitions. But more than that, the word mutability expresses change, and yes, change in terms of decay and mortality, but also, as you say, it's kind of green shoots, freshness, could be anything.
You're very interested in the notions of geography and lack of geography. You've said yourself you don't come like Seamus Heaney from one of those landscapes which were full of loam and clay and which can be reflected in the syllables and the vocatives of the language. But for you, it seems that there was a sort of epiphany moment with around the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop.
Yes.
And I'd just like you to tell us a little bit about her and that.
That's right. I still envy that in Seamus Heaney, that he can equate language with landscape. He talks about Val Meadows, and there's a sense of rootedness in the poems, which is fascinating. But my experience was really as a traveller, and it would be too grand in a way to say that I'm a poet of exile like Dante. I couldn't say that, but I have travelled, moved around a lot, heard a lot of different kinds of English. And certainly when I was younger, I thought perhaps that then meant that I didn't have the qualifications to be a proper poet. So finding a poet like Elizabeth Bishop, who also travelled and in fact made that the essence of her aesthetic. So her books are called things like Questions of Travel, Geography 3, and that was a kind of illumination, my kind of light bulb moment, that you could actually make a strength of what I'd previously seen as a disadvantage. And it's a modern, we see it in Dante as an exile too, but it's a kind of modern sensibility. We all move around now. We all hear lots of different English. Very few of us are rooted to one spot for much of our lives. In a way, we all stand in front of the mirror in the morning and make ourselves up for that day in more than one way.
These are poems. They're like being in front of a mirror. They are quite short. They are about a moment and a thought around a moment and perhaps a particular landscape. I'm going to ask you to read one in a moment. But I just wanted before that to ask whether you think that the kind of poetry produced by Dante, that is long, omnivorous, gregarious, political poetry about ideas with lots of headlines and characters coming in and out of it, whether that notion of poetry has really gone for the modern world.
No, I would dispute that. I think that kind of poetry is essential. It just so happens in this moment in history that we tend to write shorter poems. But you'll find something that relates to the long poem in that many poetry books are, if you like the concept album in music, they are linked and themed, and the poems wind around each other. And that's something that's relatively new. And to that extent, I think you can say, in a way, we're still performing the long poem, but it just looks different.
I was going to ask you to read a poem now, but actually China wants to come in, so let's keep the conversation going for a moment.
Well, just picking up directly on that point, I presume that you spend a long time not just sort of collecting the poems together, but thinking about things like order and so on. Because for me, for example, there's one poem in this collection, Scorpion, that sat there like a strange tooth in a mouth. And this is a compliment, by the way. And there was something so extraordinary about that poem, not just in itself, but vis-a-vis the other poems around it, and so on. And so I'm wondering about that process of, how long you spend saying, let's put this one here, swap them around, that sort of thing.
It takes ages. In a way, for a book like this, the book becomes like a big poem, and the sense of ordering the other poems is akin to putting together a short poem. And I think a poem like Scorpion is one of those kind of fulcrum poems in which perhaps the whole collection turns. So when you read the next poem, you will have changed because of the experience of that one, and it kind of leads you in.
It's like shaping a book, or like hanging an exhibition. Actually, you were talking about the importance of Helen Chadwick, but it's like creating an exhibition.
I think that's exactly right.
And the context of it. I mean, I think what Jo Shapcott's saying is very important, actually, in relation to her own work, but also to nowadays and the understanding we have of poetry. Wallace Stevens said that poetry is part of the structure of reality, and I think a lot of people who don't read poetry aren't really aware of this. They think that poets are people on the fringes or the margins of life, rather than having essential things to say about the actual nature of reality. And one of the things about this book is that, yes, it's all the things that have been said round this table, holding up a mirror to moments of reality, but it reminds us of our mortality through the particular experiences and the particular articulations of each page. To that extent, it's just as important an analysis of mortality and mutability as a medical textbook would be. They're both reflecting on the same thing, or as a geographical textbook, or as a piece of journalism. It's not a kind of a pretty extra poetry. It is actually trying to get to the heart of things.
I think that's right. And what people forget too is that poems are full of ideas and should be, and that we can feel as passionate about ideas as we do when we're in love. I mean, you can be in love with an idea,
exactly.
And I think poems realise that.
Wallace Stevens is that sometimes there's a moment in life to put ideas to one side,
yes,
and to understand experience in terms of language.
That's right.
And not always to have notions.
I think that's absolutely true, and that even though some of the events in these poems are made up, in a sense that doesn't matter, because there's a sense of that DNA of experience, to use Jonathan's words.
Jo, if you don't read a poem quite quickly, I'm going to start to read them for you, so you better get going. Which poem are you going to read?
I'm going to read a short poem called I Go Inside the Tree. Indoors for this ash is through the bark. Notice its colour, asphalt or slate in the rain. Then go inside, tasting weather in the tree rings, scoffing years of drought and storm, moving as fast as a woodworm who finds a kick of speed for burrowing into the core, for mouthing pith and sap, until the oh, my God, at the heart.
And that reminds us about one other thing before we move on. These are very much bodily poems, aren't they? They're poems about flesh and taste and sense.
Very much so. And I think perhaps all the works we're discussing today share that kind of interest in creating a texture of a time or an individual. And I'm concerned to do that too.
Well, let's move on to textures and individuals and indeed time of a very different and alienating form. China Mieville's latest book, Embassy Town, takes place on the edge of a vast part of space through which people move in ways we as readers struggle to fully understand. And I'm going to come on to the Arieki, is that how I say it?
Well, that's how I say it. I don't really mind how people say it.
who are the key aliens in this science fiction book in a moment. But before we get to those, China, somebody picking up this book is going to be confronted quite quickly within the first page, and then certainly the first 30 or 40, 50 pages, by many words they won't understand, by concepts which seem to slip away, and you make the reader work quite hard, and that's something that's deliberate, presumably.
It is, and I know that, I would know anyway, but, I'm not one of those writers who pretends I don't read reviews, so I know very much that there are some readers who don't like this at all, and that fair enough, to each their own. But I do think there tends to be two different sort of kind of wings in a lot of modern fiction, which is books that work by essentially kind of recognition and those that work by estrangement. And you can do really interesting things with both kinds. But I think within the science fiction tradition and the fantastic tradition, paradoxically quite like the modernist tradition actually, although in a very different way, that part of the draw is to try to estrange the reader. And then speaking for myself as a reader, I not only do I not mind that, I genuinely like that, as long as I don't feel that as long as I feel that the right...
Well, what's the point of estrangement?
Well, I think defamiliarization is a well-worn and well understood sort of technique for kind of potentially radically recasting the everyday, and
to shake people out of their comfortable notions of reality. And
well, I wouldn't want to sound too sort of self-aggrandizing about it, but certainly as a reader, it has a similar effect that. For example, some surrealist texts have, I think, for me, is this, a sense of the ground underneath your feet being completely unsafe. And as long as I trust the writer that either I will come to understand or that it will be part of the effect that I won't understand and that's okay, to me that's tremendously exhilarating.
Well, let's turn to the Arieke then, who are two-headed alien monsters. We don't see them full on, they're glimpsed more often. But the crucial thing about them is that they have no sense of metaphor. They cannot therefore lie because the word is the thing itself. Just talk us through this.
Well, I've for a very long time been very interested in both kind of theories of metaphor and philosophies of language in general, but also sort of the crossover of theology and linguistics and these arguments about the Adamic language and the language in the Garden of Eden, where the word is the thing, and this notion essentially that is human language a fall, and if it is a fall, what kind of fall is it? Maybe it's rather a good fall, and so I don't think that the idea of a language without symbolic thought and lying and so on is probably possible in the real world, as it were, but it struck me as a really interesting way into sort of taking this notion very, very seriously for the length of the book, to try and kind of examine ideas of consciousness and personality and symbolism in general. Because
certainly there's a vast difference between the pictogram kind of language where language starts as a drawing of the thing, and the language that we all use, which is syllabic, and the Phoenicians gave it to us and so forth. And what you're trying to say is try to imagine a third form of language outside both of those.
Exactly, yes. And I very much wouldn't want the language of the Arieke to be read as code for some particular human language. It seems to me to be very importantly not radically different from that.
And the Arieke, there is no difference between the word apple and an apple. And therefore, and this passes through everything, and that's why they can't lie. It's why they can't lie, and it's why if they want to use figurative speech at all, they have to construct a situation which they can then refer to. So, if you wanted to say, "Oh, I feel like an angry lion today," you would have had to get a lion and make it angry, so that you could then say, "I feel like the angry lion that exists there." Yes. Otherwise you couldn't say it because it didn't exist. And one of your characters is a simile. She is a simile. Yes, that's her job. A kind of minor celebrity.
Sorry, but it is absolutely essential to all the things we've been talking about. Yes. Up to now, actually, this, because there are an awful lot of people who hold the floor in public discourse in the West who are like the Arieke. I know it's not a satire, I know that it is alien, because they think that because the world is that which is the case, that language can automatically describe it if you just get it right. And of course that's not the case. Language is metaphor. And we are all, as the later Wittgenstein realised, we're all imprisoned in our own language games. You can't get outside the language you speak. Language is metaphor. Metaphor is our way of understanding the world. But of course, it's not true. And that's where theology and philosophy and all these other things come into your book. I mean, it's wonderfully interesting, the confrontation between the Arieke, who are in this blissful, innocent world that people like Richard Dawkins or Jonathan Miller think you can be in, and the world of metaphor that the rest of us belong to. Jonathan.
Yeah, I must say, to begin with, I found your book quite difficult. The moment that I kind of got it was when I thought, what you've done is you've taken an idea from the third book of Gulliver's Travels, where these people travel around and instead of using words, they actually have a bag of things, so there's no gap between the words and the things. And then you've taken an idea from the fourth book of Gulliver's Travels, these other characters, these horses, the Winhams, who cannot lie, can only speak the truth. And you put the two together. And I just wondered if if you were aware that was what you had done.
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned Gulliver's Travels, because absolutely, I mean, you don't write a book about strange creatures that can't lie without the Winhams in your head. But there is also a very strong sort of within genre tradition of examining questions of language, writers like Ian Watson and various others, and the overlap of language and concepts and symbolism and so on. And so, yes, that was very much something I wanted to do, and sort of cross-fertilise it with a science fictional tradition.
Joe?
I was fascinated too by the way you inverted so much of what we experience in terms of metaphor. For example, the Arieki having two mouths, for us, that's double and that equals lying. But in your construct, that equals truth. And I began to see them almost as walking metaphors. They have both the tenor and the vehicle of the metaphor inside them working at the same time, although they can't see it because they're attached to the concrete.
Yeah. Well, I'm obviously partisan on this question, but I think that science fiction is uniquely well placed to examine questions of metaphor and literalising metaphor and having its cake and eat it, that it does metaphors very well, but also sort of glories in the surplus of metaphor, the fact that metaphors always escape the symbolic intent of the speaker or writer, which for me is part of the whole point and what makes them magic in a way that similes and allegory is not.
They always escape, but we don't. That's what's so brilliant about this book.
We also love metaphors which stretch the furthest, the ones which are most unlike in comparison to the thing they're being compared with. They excite us most, so the bigger the lie, the better.
There's a note to end on. We've been stretched as far as we can. The BBC complaints desk is already in meltdown from calls from yahoos around the country. But thanks for all my guests. China Mieville's Embassy Town and AN Wilson's Dante in Love are both out now, and you can see Jonathan Bate's Being Shakespeare, performed by Simon Callow, at the Trafalgar Studios in London right up until July the 23rd. Joe Shapcott, meanwhile, is at the Ledbury Poetry Festival on Saturday this week. And that is it from Start the Week until the autumn. We're back on the 12th of September with a special programme on Russia and the extraordinary life and work of the wonderful writer Vasily Grossman. If you want to know how you can come along and hear the recording of the programme in Oxford, please visit, inevitably, the Start the Week website. But for now, have a good summer and goodbye. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, it's our last programme of the summer, and I'm joined by some wonderful writers today, by the poet Joe Shapcott, whose latest collection of Mutability won the Costa Prize this year, and by the science fiction writer China Mieville, who's been compared with Kafka and Orwell, and whose new novel features creatures who cannot lie. But we're going to start with one of the great perennial questions. How much, if anything, do we need to know about the lives of great writers to fully appreciate their work? Jonathan Bate is one of our best Shakespearean scholars, and he's written the one-man show Being Shakespeare, currently being performed by Simon Callow. But we're going to start with one of the very few writers who rivals Shakespeare, Dante, subject of a new biography by AN Wilson. Andrew, your proposition is that to understand Dante, but particularly Paradise Lost, you've got to, the comedy I should say, you've got to understand the medieval world, and the medieval world is slipping away from us.
I think that's true. I mean, Dante was a very extraordinary figure in the history of Europe, because he was arguably one of the great poets, such as Shakespeare and Goethe, but he was also one of those figures, one thinks of it this week particularly in Radio 4 terms because of Aung San Suu Kyi's Wreath lectures. He was one of those figures who stood out alone against, at the time when Dante, who was a very serious politician, I mean, when he was in his 30s, wanting to control Florence. Corso Donati and the Pope stitched Dante up. The Pope, all the popes in the Middle Ages except one, were canon lawyers. The Pope wanted to control not only the Italian peninsula, but Europe itself. And he was a very smooth operator, Boniface VIII. he'd done all sorts of things. He'd been to England, he'd been to Portugal, he'd been all over Europe, with his finger in every pie. Very tall, gay, probably an atheist, which I think probably helps if you're Pope, because otherwise you can just be totally cynical.
Yes.
And Dante abominated him. The poem is set in the year 1300. They just invented the idea of purgatory about 50 years before, and Dante makes the idea of purgatory into a very beautiful one. And most Catholics' idea of purgatory doesn't really come from the Church, it actually comes from Dante, though they don't realise that. But the Pope suddenly saw the enormous cash value of this. You couldn't get to the Holy Land because of the Crusades going on. He quarrelled with the Eastern Church. So in order to save your soul and get time off purgatory, come to Rome for the Holy Year. And in that year, 1300, at Easter, when Dante went with the pilgrims, and he describes it all, there were priests in the main pilgrim centres with rakes, literally raking money off the...
He lost his own position in the extremely... I didn't realise until I was reading a book, I'd forgotten quite how violent and extreme the politics of Florence were, not simply between the pro-papal party and the pro-emperor party, but within the parties as well, the black and the white.
Within the parties, which were complicated, but actually the story of Dante is quite simple, namely that his father, who was a moneylender, in fact he kept pretty dark, married him off when he was about 12 years old, or betrothed him to one of these big mafia-style families, the Donati. And that was both the making of them, the Dante family, the Alighieri, but it was also the undoing of Dante Alighieri when he grew up, because he quarrelled with this man they called Il Barone, the Baron, who was a very nasty piece of work indeed, Corso Donati, who was his cousin, his wife's cousin. Other members of the family, who also come into the poem, he loved. Forese Donati, who was one of his best muckers as a rising young writer, and he swapped dirty jokes and sex poems and jokes about their impotence or otherwise and so forth. So, I mean, it's wrong to think of Dante as too solemn a figure. He wasn't.
And tell us about Pope Boniface VIII, because he's the other great sort of villain of the figure.
Well, he's Dante's bête noire. He was the Pope at the Orpheus.
Yes.
And that was an image which stays in your head, I think.
For the modern reader, Dante, you remind us how intensely important the politics of the time are, European politics, but also the great religious questions of the time. For a reader who is not a Christian, how much is there in Dante?
Well, there's everything, because what he's writing about is human experience. This journey he makes through the three regions, which are mythological regions, hell, purgatory, heaven. It's the journey that we all make. The poem doesn't begin in the middle of my life, it begins in the middle of our life. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. And we all have the experience of total disillusionment and possible hell.
In the dark wood.
In the dark wood. We all go through purgatory, and we all hope to get to some kind of self-fulfillment and realization. And for Dante, it was a revisitation of his childhood friendships and loves, and a rediscovery of what love is. And that's the central quest of his poem, to rediscover the love that he knew as a child for this little girl called Beatrice. And if that's not important and central to everybody, I don't know what is.
You use Proust a lot as a comparison.
He's very like Proust. He's very like Proust indeed, in that his personal vision is used and generalised to become the vision of a totally corrupt political system, a bit like Solzhenitsyn did in the Soviet days. And people read this poem, The Divine Comedy, partly as a political thing, so that I think unless you understand what the setup was during his lifetime, it is quite hard to grasp why he was so angry and why he'd been chucked out of Florence. And it's again very topical, because at the basis of it all was the question of the European currency. That was the central fact, that the emperor alone could license money, could mint money, and there hadn't been an emperor since 1250. Dante was born in 1265, so for the first half of his life, when he was a rising politician as well as a great young poet, Florence hence florins, was the place where money was minted. So who controlled Florence controlled Italy and Europe and ultimately the world. And that's why the popes and the would-be emperors were fighting to get the Florentines on side, because all the money in Europe, the only coin which anybody could exchange for value was the florin from Florence. That's why Florence was the richest, biggest, most important city in Europe. And that's why he felt, with his rather old-fashioned fogyish Christian views, he felt that Florence had given itself over to gold and money and been utterly destroyed and lost its soul.
And in the course of that, of course, he